right, so hello and welcome to Inquiring Minds, the Writing and Literacy SIG podcast. I'm Christopher, your host for our first episode of 2025. We are so delighted to have you join us today on Inquiring Minds as we delve into discussions relevant to the writing and literacies field.
And I'm Molly, your co host. The Writing and Literacy SIG podcast is committed to highlighting scholarly work that explores current topics and nurturing dialogue among members of the special interest group and the wider writing and literacies community. Our aim is to ignite discussions nationwide among faculty, graduate students, and anyone intrigued by pertinent themes within the realms of writing, literacy, and education at large.
So in this episode of Inquiring Minds, we're excited to be joined by five guests who are going to contribute to this discussion on poetry, writing, and its connection to literacy learning and teaching. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Stephanie Abraham, Dr. Sarah Donovan, Dr. Victoria Gill, and Darius Phelps. Now, each guest will introduce themselves. Please share your name, your institutional or community affiliations, and anything else you believe is relevant to our discussion. We'll go ahead and start with Dr. Gill.
Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Gill. I'm an assistant professor at Lesley University in the PhD in Educational Studies Department and Language and Literacy. I'm Lao Punjabi first generation child of genocide survivors. And I have a partner and two kids, one boy and one trans girl. Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll go ahead and pass it to Dr. Sarah Donovan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Donovan. I am Associate Professor of Secondary English Education at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. And we have a really great community of teacher writers on ethical ELA for the last 5 or 6 years, where we have thousands of poems written by teachers, and we would love to have you write with us.
Dr. Stephanie Abrahams.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Stephanie Abraham, and I'm an associate professor of literacy at Rowan University in New Jersey. But I live in Philadelphia and originally from Georgia. My research usually focuses on emergent bilingual children and transnational teacher education. And I'll talk more about why I write poetry, but it's kind of in all parts of my work.
Yeah, and Darius.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Darius Phelps. I'm a former early childhood educator of 13 years, a PhD candidate in English education at Teachers College, and I am assistant director at NYU. My work focuses a lot on poetic inquiry and narrative reflection with teacher identity. So looking forward to being in conversation.
Thank you all so much for introducing yourselves. Our first question to start our conversation is about the many ways that poetry is represented across your work. So tell us about how poetry relates to your work and to the broader literacies field.
Yeah, and I guess, if anyone is feeling compelled to speak first, that's fine as well. So just go ahead and unmute yourself whenever you're ready.
I can jump in. Um, yeah, for me, I know poetry is at the core of my work because it's a form of inquiry, but most importantly, a way of knowing and a means of resistance. My research specifically is grounded in poetic inquiry and narrative reflection, where poetry is not just an aesthetic practice, but a critical and a liberatory one. And then, like when it comes to the broader field of literacies, poetry disrupts dominant narratives, making spaces for voices and stories that have been historically marginalized. So, through mentor texts, poetry circles, narrative practices, I invite my students, whether K through 12 or pre-service teachers, to use poetry as a tool for self-exploration, advocacy, and also, most importantly, reimagining what education can and should be.
I'll jump in and build off what Darius said so nicely that yeah, writing poetry is a way to push back against many things that constrain us. And I think that in my work, I've done that, or I do that in a couple of ways. And I write poetry for a public audience, and it comes about always because I was working in the field. I'm an ethnographer, and data pops up, and I want to be able to represent it in a way that isn't found in an academic journal. And so usually, not always, but it comes out in a poem. And so that's one way that I write poetry, and I hope that it's reaching an audience that's not just the one that reads academic journals, please. And then I do use poetry still within that academic form. And I think I have a different reason for doing that. And it's big word, like a different epistemological basis, right? I'm asking people to actively question what we think we have found when we write these academic journals. And I feel like poetry already lends itself to that interpretive lens. And so putting poetry in there makes, I hope, the reader question about what does this mean and how absolute is that meaning that we present there in that portion that we call the findings of something. So I think that's why I'm doing poetry.
Yeah, so I guess Dr. Gill, you can go ahead and jump in and then we'll end this portion with Dr. Donovan.
Okay, I was more looking forward to answering the other questions though. So, Dr. Donovan, you want to go first? Go for it.
Okay, well, I think the poetry sort of came um, personally during COVID-19 when I was really struggling with being isolated and being in a new teaching position. And also at a time when I wasn't able to use my body in the way that I like to with sports and athletics. And I did a lot of writing at that time to try to make sense of it. And I found that like a lot of the youth that I taught in junior high and also some of the college students were struggling, being isolated and not able to play the sports and be included in school the way that they had come to know and love. A lot of students show up to school so that they can play their sport. So I found that we were lacking sports poems for youth. And during that time, I just, I was looking for them, and I did a study with a college runner and trying to understand how it was for him. And we found that reading and writing poetry was the best way for him to make sense of what he was feeling. And he wasn't even a writer or a poet. He just found that that was the best way that it emerged. And so out of that study, came an initiative to gather poems from YA authors and scholars to share some poetry about athletes. And so it launched this first anthology called Rhyme and Rhythm, anthology for student athletes. And that sparked additional kinds of writing. But really, I, like all of you said, like I turned to poetry for a way of making sense of things that other forms resisted.
All right. Thank you all for starting off with that first question and sharing your ideas about poetry and its relation to your work and the broader literacies field. We've heard some amazing ideas like poetry as a form of inquiry, ways of knowing, resistance, and pushing back against constraints, even poetry represented through data, and also poetry as a way to use our body in a different way and make sense of other forms from our panelists. So this brings us to our next question. We know poetry is a very unique form of composition. I'd like to invite everyone to speak a little bit about the affordances and potentials of poetry for your work with teachers, youth, communities of your own composing, and how does poetry allow us to go beyond other forms of writing? So we'll go ahead and start with Dr. Gill on this question.
Thank you, Christopher. I would say from my experience of teaching poetry to pre and in-service teachers, and even workshops, everyone is always on edge at first. And I mean everyone, even the folks who dabble, right? There's so much fear and shame even before I say, hello, welcome. And I wonder, why is that? I really appreciate this question, truly, about poetry allowing us to, quote unquote, go beyond other forms of writing. And yet, perhaps that's the problem, right? Maybe people are viewing poetry as so beyond the realm of regular writing that poetry writing is othered. It's this esoteric thing that can't be captured and enjoyed freely by everyone. Or worse, folks have some trauma from it being forced to think that Shakespeare is the epitome of it, right? And so no, when I work with the teachers, youth, and do community workshops on poetry, I always start with like saying everyone is a poet. It's just about allowing yourself the freedom and the space to play around to figure out what kind of poet you are. I want poetry to be part of the mundane, be part of everyday life, of regular thought processes. I want folks to think of poetry as another equal form of basic writing strategies that we teach in schools, besides the basics of expository, descriptive, persuasive, and narrative. I want poetry to be on there an equal platform, right? I want folks to feel poetic. I want them to see the poetry in normal, everyday, regular things, as feel it as often as they feel their own feelings. I really just want people to revel in poetry as part of their humanity.
I don't know, just to echo what Dr. Gill said, is that I had a very similar response to that question, is that, I mean, the question is framed that poetry is unique, and maybe it is unique, but it is every day. I hear poetry on the radio, and how I always hear it in how children speak, which is where much of where my poetry comes from. Is I just steal their words and then it becomes poetry somehow. I'm not sure. And I think there is that when I teach poetry, I'm usually teaching much younger people. So they're usually children between like 6 and 8. So they're not traumatized by the sonnet yet. And so they just run with it, right? I start off with shape poems or body poems or something like that. And then they're just like, what is this? I don't have to put a capital letter and I don't have to put a period. And they love it. So I think it's that breaking apart form and being able to play around with words, which children and youth already do so well. So it's really just building off those practices and like maybe putting some letters and words to it into some form somewhere, and then poetry just kind of comes out to me.
I love that you said that children have no issue with this. And it just reminds me that our typical schooling, its function is to kill creativity.
It's funny you mention that because I feel like now with the current times, we need that more than ever. I know that's for me, that's why I started writing. Sarah and I have had conversations about this too in the past, just me dealing with grief, like losing my grandfather. So for me, I know poetry is creates the entry point for vulnerability, for processing, those lived experiences, for building connections across different cultures, and I feel like it's embodied in us, like we were saying earlier. It's like it's in our breath, it's in the cadence of our voices, it's the space between words, it's like the unsaid. So I just to piggyback off what you were saying, I totally connect with that.
And I think one of the other affordances of it is its length and size. I think, yes, there are really long poems for sure, and they're really complex. Some seem super easy to write and others are not. So just because it's short doesn't mean it's easy to write. It's something you can write in a short period of time, though I prefer to set a timer for 10 minutes and do whatever I can in that time. Um, but I think that there is something accessible about the brevity of a poem, the economy of words, the white space on the page, the freedom to make line breaks when you wish and use punctuation as you need to, or to fill a breath or fill a gap or make a mark of series of dots that symbolize some sort of heartache. So like there's so much potential in all those things in the writing of it. And so when we write with teachers at the beginning of a workshop, or students that I'm meeting for the first time and introduce them to a short poem, they realize very quickly that they can do a lot in a short period of time, and yet it's so complex and rich and beautiful, and they have something to share and something to celebrate, and they walk out of there feeling really great about that they just wrote a poem. And so when we do these poem workshops every month with teachers, you can come in and spend 10 minutes and do a little bit of writing, and then you can read a dozen poems in just a few minutes, and they're like poems that didn't exist 5 minutes ago all exist are in the world, and you can read a bunch of different perspectives so quickly in the brevity of poems, and then you can linger and spend as much time as you want to in them as well, versus those super long short stories that are 30 pages that you can't barely finish in a week, or the 200 and 500 page novels that we're trying to study and make the students read for 8 weeks. Like it just doesn't lend itself to the kind of inclusivity that the affordance of a poetry and poems can do.
Thank you so much, everyone. We've heard about making poetry accessible to all people, repositioning poetry as part of our everyday lives, and the freedom inherent in poetry writing. So our next question is that poetry is both personal and relational. So what connections can you draw between poetry and identities, either individual identities or collective identities shared and formed in community with others?
I'll go first and just talk about that. I've mentioned that it's usually from children that I get inspired to write poetry, and this preparing for this podcast made me think about why. And why has that been the case over several, I mean, over, a decade or more now, that it has been children's speech that inspires me to incorporate their words into poetry. And I just wrote this down and thought about that when children talk, they are so honest and truthful, and they are often filled with this insightful critique of our society that it seems like can only come from that view of the world. Because as we mentioned before, when they get older, they get traumatized by things that have happened at school, and then writing gets all caught up in that, and poetry in lots of forms. But it seems like when they're young, especially between that 5 to 10 years old, that they just say these amazing things about the world that only they can see. And that, for me, that lends itself to writing poetry. It's brief, like Dr. Donovan said. I can capture it. It's concrete, it's real, and you can hear it. The voice comes out through it automatically.
I think just to piggyback too off of what Dr. Abrams was saying, I realized through my work with pre and in-service teachers, they're not just composing words, they're mapping their identities. You see their cultural lineage come through, the way they see the world. Poetry fosters belonging because it affirms that every story is worth telling, no matter what that looks like. In the classroom, I've seen poetry cultivate racial literacy, which was mind-blowing for me, especially in the beginning. How the students use their words and verses to interrogate power, reflect on representation, and name their own experiences in ways that aligns with the work of scholars like Dr. Yolanda Celia Ruiz. Um, so really just having that allows them to bear witness to each other's truth. And that creates that shared sense of identity, and not only identity, but a brave space, and most importantly, solidarity.
Yeah, I think that's something that happens when you can create the spaces where teachers or students can exchange their poems or share their poems and witness one another's stories, and that they're distinctly different. And the distinct differences is where those relationships really happen. And I think when we're writing with teachers, the writing that I do with teachers and specifically is an opportunity for them to talk about the things that are happening in their classroom, and that all the teachers in their group can kind of relate to the stories of a student throwing up during class, um, or the student that's just brilliant and tells the funny joke, or the student that is really brave and tries something new. Like, they can tell those stories, but the teachers also have real lives, and they're navigating the Alzheimer's of a mother, or the death of a baby, or depression, or the ending of a marriage. And teachers need someone to bear witness to that with them in ways that maybe a friend or family member can't do that, but another teacher can. And sometimes those digital spaces really bring such proximity and intimacy in a little bit of the anonymity. It's really fascinating to think about that, but I think teachers are desperate to be heard and seen as full human beings. And poetry allows that exchange of those real life scenes that are often left off of social media and in the mainstream understanding of what and who a teacher is.
Thank you. I wanted to share my answer for this, and I hope you'll allow me to get on a soapbox. I have a longer answer to this one, and I just wanted to start off with like the first part of the answer being like in Western American Eurocentric literature and systems, there's this heavy emphasis on men and individualism, and that has bled into, and it works the same way in the world of writers, right? Everyone is taught to, for example, in our American education, to celebrate Henry David Thoreau and his book Walden, where he spent a couple of years in the woods so that he could find himself and be completely self-reliant, right? And yet it's not widely known that the only reason he got to do this was because he had his mom do his laundry and get him food the whole time, and that the only reason that he was on that land was out of a favor from his friend, Ralph Waldo Emerson, right? And so I think it's just ironic that this text about being a self-reliant man only happened because of the labor of a woman and the generosity of a friend. So my point being that individualism is definitely a plague that even bleeds into arts, so much so that the collective identities and art formed in communities aren't really taught in schools or even talked about, right? So I think another way that school does this kind of work, it reinforces the dichotomy between self and society, where there shouldn't be such a harmful divide. Poetry, like everything else, is political. I don't think it can be consumed out of context, and I think it really shouldn't, right? And the second part to this answer, thank you for bearing with me, to folks like in my culture, historically speaking, poetry was embodied. It was collective, and it is a thing that was to be performed and felt by multiple parties, right? So experiencing poetry was to share relationship. Poetry isn't just some dead thing that exists on a paper written by someone, read by someone else somewhere, some other time, right? For example, the ghazal, 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 it's a poetry genre and form, historically speaking, starting in medieval Persia and Arabia. And now, till this day, it's actually more popular in India and Pakistan. And just like a sonnet, it's very sophisticated and it's complicated. It has its own particular rules and rhymes, 5 to 10, 15 couplets. And it has major themes that include love, nostalgia, pangs of separation, anguish, right? And it's to be sung. I would say jokingly, but also kind of seriously, I think it was like emo music before there was emo music. And so, but the best part that I love about the ghazal is that it's poetry that is collectively shared in community, right? There would normally be a singer who's accompanied by a harmonium player and the tabla, which is like a little drum player, right? And it would take place in a mahfil, which means a gathering. And that can be an informal gathering, like in the days of my father, where they would just sit down, gather in the village under a very large tree and just listen, right? Or in modern days, a mahfil can be a concert hall. And another example from my very specific culture, language, and ancestors is a poetry genre called boliyan. Boliyan are like Punjabi couplets that are sung out loud and they're danced with like a rhythmic clapping and in a large circle. But to me, the best part is that it usually starts with one woman, specifically a woman. Men do them too, but traditionally speaking, it starts with one woman and then another joins and then another joins. And then now you have a chorus of voices, right? And so what also boliyan are usually passed down orally from generation to generation. And so I just really love that the poetry in my South Asian cultures are collective, they're generational, it's not individualistic, they're performed with the whole body and not just things intellectually existing on paper. And I love that it's orally expressed and not just written, right? In the Western world, the written is God, right? And so thinking about pushing it back against that. And lastly, I love that it's crossing boundaries and inclusive of multiple modalities. Poetry to us means being set to singing, dancing, music, and lastly, poetry means community. Thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you all so much for this discussion so far. I tend to write poetry too. I look at it as a lot like observations in the world and just things that I'm feeling at particular moments in time. Sometimes I'll look at like a bouquet of flowers and literally just observe it. Um, like I don't know. I see metaphors to like everyday life and like these different things in my own life that I connect to like flowers, like living their life on earth and then like kind of just passing through time. And for me, it's a very felt, embodied sense. And then when I speak the words, it's like a different thing. And if I'm around people and they hear the words, it's even different. Like it's like this shared feeling. So I really like this notion of thinking about poetry as this collective felt embodied performance with not just only words, but with what's spoken and what's said and what's felt through the words and the power that it holds. And, oftentimes in schools, we don't get to that level of um, like profound thinking. I think it often gets set aside. Like, I mean, where I am in Texas, right? It's often just a standardized passage on the STAR test, and it's like, oh, we got to teach strategies about stanzas and lines and, you know, relate to like figurative language, which I mean are a huge part of it, right? Um, and I'm wondering too, like when we think about that, like it's in connection to our next question and the scholarships related to K through 12 classrooms. But in schools, like we see these standalone units with poetry as part of the literacy block. And often this is like a few weeks of the school year and like in my state, like I was saying, like in relation to a standardized test and not these other things that I'm feeling and do like daily, right? Like I like that earlier we said that poetry is also, in other people, in the words, right? In the rhythm of living. Um, so I really resonate with that, and I'm really thinking about what are the possibilities that you all see for this expansive engagement with poetry across the curriculum, the school day, and even the school year, right? As we think about teachers in context and even working with teachers, right? Like, how do we get to that level of thinking that we're having right now in our schools across, not just in Texas, but across the United States and even across the world, right? So I know is anyone feeling compelled to answer this? Because that would be like if you're feeling compelled, then definitely go for it. But if not, we can pose it off to someone.
I actually kind of have a variation follow-up question kind of thing that goes back to what Dr. Gill kind of said at the beginning about how writing instruction in schools is even the standards written about writing instruction are divided into three modes of writing: narrative, argument, informational. The structure of the standards across our entire country is set up in this way that then teachers are teaching according to the standards, or textbooks are developed according to those standards, and the units are developed around those as well. And the writing instruction piece is so small compared to the reading instruction piece of that as well. Um, and I don't know if it's a disservice that the standards are organized by mode that perpetuates this like separation of these things. And also that in these standards, I don't know that the word is poetry is actually even included, maybe more than once, if at all, in any of those standards. And I don't know if including them in the standard would change the way it's instructed or would propel a different kind of movement or advocacy for what that can be. But there seems to be this understanding that writing is sort of this correct form of these modes, and writing is not all these beautiful, important, complex, rich, cultural, social, emotional experiences that everyone is talking about here. So I don't know, I'm really curious to see what you all think about that, the idea of these standards or the way that writing instruction is in school, and if that's like undermining the potential of poetry in the classroom. I mean, that's really what I'm seeing, and I would like to start a movement. What can we do?
Just to support Dr. Donovan's argument, I would say yes. I mean, absolutely. That's what's going on right now in K to 12 schools in the US, at least. I would argue probably in lots of other places because school seems to feel the same no matter where you go in the world. Um, and most of my work in writing poetry for the past 10 years has been working in a community writing center for young children. And I offer a poetry workshop, and 20 kids show up and they're like, we're going to write poetry. And they're like, yes. So, I mean, I don't have an issue with it. Like, I always have children who come and want to write poetry. And then when I say we're going to do it, we just do it. And then it's so very easy. And they write such beautiful things. And, I can't ever believe that any of these children would struggle with writing at school, but many of their parents tell me that they are, which is why they made them go to, the writing center. Um, but yeah, so it seems like there's huge disconnect between kind of how I see it in my practice and how I see children react to it with how I see it done also in public schools at least.
And just to piggyback off of what was all said too, I've taught in both private and public. And I think for me, all the students, especially when I taught fourth and fifth grade, they found poetry so intimidating. They're like, what is this? So I always tied it into like music. I'm like, let's look at hip hop. Hip hop is poetry. Pop music is poetry. Let's dissect what you listen to on your way to school or at home and take it from there, just really set that strong foundation. And I think really using that and interweaving it into the curricula, it just makes more natural sense. You can teach about historical narratives, even Christopher, what you were saying about observation, tied into your science units, using poetry as like a way of method of explaining and actually teaching and talking, with art. There's so many different ways to do it, making zines, poetry night, tying in poetry to art. I mean, there's so many endless possibilities, but I feel like what we said earlier is that In a sense, it's like they're trying to silence our voices, but also take away all complete creativity when we need it the most.
I agree with that 100%. And just to, what Dr. Donovan was saying as well, like in terms of like schooling, for what I like to share with teachers in my courses or workshops or in the articles and poems that I write, like Darius was saying earlier, like how poetry is protest, poetry is resistance, poetry can be taking pain, turning it into power, right? And so when I teach my course and I have pre and in-service teachers from all grades, from K through 12, all content subjects, and I challenge them to include poetry in everything. What does poetry look like in a third grade science lesson about the life cycle of a butterfly? What does poetry look like in the concept of division and subtraction, right? Just like literacy isn't only the English teacher's job, maybe poetry and art can be everyone's joy and privilege as well, right? I also make sure to challenge the teachers to think of ways to pair poetry with the text that they're using, whether it's children's picture books or to include poetry genres that are global, like I mentioned, ghazals and boliyan. I challenge them to think about poetry outside of what it means to be on lines and papers on page. I like to think that it's critical that teachers bring in living poets as well. There's an entire movement on hashtag living poets, right? And instead of celebrating just the whole dead white men thing that we currently have going on, right? Encourage them to think about BIPOC poets, women and trans poets, non-English poets, local poets into them. Write this into your curriculum. Have them as guest speakers in the flesh, right? If you can. There isn't some special venue. There are poets everywhere, every day. It just takes that like extra effort to know your context that you're working in, and finding space and providing a stage for them, right? And just like when you were talking about vulnerability earlier, right? We want to ensure that poetry isn't this thing that is jarring and makes you vulnerable in a way that makes people feel overexposed, like their guts are on the floor, or that they just don't feel good enough, right? But vulnerable in a way where they're like pulling a star out of your chest and you're holding it out, knowing it's going to shine and reveal some new or old feeling, thought, or idea that connects your shine to another person's shine. Yeah, I think, and so I think because of that, it's equally as important to teach teachers and students how to engage with another person's poetry, with their vulnerability, with their shine. There should be protocols, even as simple for like, I'd like to borrow from the kids too, when they say, don't yuck my yum, right? Or something like that. Like, tea is tea. It doesn't have to be your cup of tea, but it's still someone else's tea, right? A poem is a poem. It's not bad or good poem. It's just might not be your kind of poem. And get folks to think about how to respond in terms of strategic moves that's being done, the words, the tones, the ideas that they see or feel or hear, right? And so the idea of etiquette of responding and engaging in poetry, like for example, snapping when you're at a spoken word performance is really important too. I remember working with my littles, and that's something that we talk about as well, the etiquette of poetry like performances. But basically, in summary, when I think about schools and I think about the way poetry and reading and writing and literacy is taught, I think the biggest possibility and potential of poetry is that poetry isn't an add-on piece to writing. I think poetry is a tool for elevating writing.
Yeah, Dr. Gill, love it. Thank you. I think like the more teacher educators are infusing that in all of their courses across all content areas, the more it is integrate, like you said at the beginning, banal or mundane, like it is core, it is part of what we do, it is part of the teacher education so that teachers know the living poets and can pull, right? They have that content knowledge, that poetry content knowledge and the poetry pedagogy knowledge across all content areas that can really be infused across all grade levels in all courses. And if the teachers are cultivated and fortified and find the joy and do that work themselves, they will share it with the students. The teachers who write poetry are like, I feel so good. This makes me so happy. And you're saying such nice things to me. I want everybody in the room to feel that. But if the teachers haven't experienced it, they're not going to do it. I love that work that you're doing.
So for our last remaining time together, thank you all for these collective reimaginings of poetry in schools. But we have this opportunity for you all to be in community with each other, and we know you might have questions beyond what we've asked. So we just wanted to sort of open the floor for a little bit to see if there was any question that any of you wanted to pose to close us out today. And no pressure if you don't, we can always edit this part out. But we just wanted to give you a chance if you have any questions for anyone else or for the group.
A question for Dr. Donovan when she was talking about her work with poetry and sports. Um, I wasn't familiar. I think you said a book that you have out on rhythm and
It's called Rhyme and Rhythm, Poems
rhyme
for
and
Street
rhythm.
Athletes.
Okay, so I'm at the community writing center that I work with. They have started a new initiative. Um, a lot of the girls complained that there were not enough community sports opportunities for them as girls, and so they've partnered with kind of a local basketball star who is starting this Sundays basketball on Sundays training something. It's something. And they're going to play basketball and then they're going to write about basketball. And then I am tasked with going to document this. And I do not play basketball. And so I'm not intimidated by the poetry part. I'm intimidated by the basketball part. And I'm thinking about how am I going to do this? So I was wondering if I've got some ideas. I was just wondering if you have any, advice.
Well, the anthology is a great place to go to look at the different ways that you can write poetry about that, about the bodies in motion and about, well, you, with the metaphor of all of those things that you are a poet, you'd be able to do that. The great thing about the anthology is that has perspectives of the spectators and the coach and the person sitting on the bench that never gets into the game, and for the person who hates PE.
Oh, that was
Got
me.
tied up in
Yeah.
the bleachers and doesn't go. Like there's a poem from that, right? And there's a poem from a gamer who's like, I don't want to put on shorts or gym shoes. I just want to game, and that's my sport. So I think, there's a way of thinking about the sport or the athlete or the event or the things that people are doing from all the different perspectives of people in the room and their experience with them. That's what's beautiful about the poetry, is it allows that space. And there's like one poem of a teenager who went with her father to her brother's basketball games, and the father was blind, and the sister had to explain everything to the father, and the sister hated basketball, but she was narrating the movements so the father could imagine it while because he wasn't able to see his son.
Okay. I think I'll have to get this. I was thinking about from the perspective of the ball
Yeah.
and those kind of things, but I think the spectator, that's a powerful one. And I was thinking about doing like just audio recordings of while they practice to try to like capture some of the sounds that come out of this kind of thing and the things that they yell and say that they could pick up and later incorporate. So I don't know. I was just like, oh my gosh, why did I sign up for this?
Well, the beginning of the beginning of the book idea came from Kwame Alexander's crossover, the crossover.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And the poem in there that looks on the page like the basketball game. And that was a mentor text that I sent to people when I started to develop the anthology, because I thought, look what it's doing on the page. Like, look what it can do for the students. And also as a junior high teacher, the students loved verse novels. They loved that book. And you can pair a sports book with a verse novel and finish it in 2 class periods. And the students were all over that. And
Okay.
they wanted to write their own poems about their sports in that way. So, I mean, finding mentor texts them, but I would love to hear and see what you come up with.
Okay. Me too. So.
When I was at Berkeley as an undergrad, I remember this distinction between people being like the hard sciences and the soft sciences, and us in literacy, the humanities, how we're considered like not real science. I always resented that, and I just feel like as social scientists, as literacy researchers, folks have always had a way of looking at us in the intellectual community, and I just thought that was really bizarre. But I did enjoy this one class at Berkeley that was titled Physics for Poets, and as someone who does not my brain just doesn't work that way. I actually enjoyed the class because the professor was able to take physical concepts like entropy and things like that and was able to break them down, process them through like a poet. And that changed everything for me. And I think, wouldn't that be cool? Kind of like how Dr. Donovan, you have this like poetry in sports. Like, what if like instead of these things that we have, like blank and blank for dummies, what if we had things like understanding neoliberalism for poets, understanding anti-capitalism for poets? Like, what if we had these things that just, I don't know, I think about that class a lot, and I think about what that would look like for us and for our kiddos to think that way.
I would like a math class for poets.
Yes, I am, yes, numerically challenged and illiterate. So I completely would read that book. Mathematics for Poets. Oh my gosh. Can you imagine? That would be amazing. Who wants to write it?
All right, well, thank you all so much for your time today on this podcast episode on poetry. I think there's so much potential in this short time that we've had together and reconsidering and reimagining the ways that poetry can be felt and expressed throughout the schools, but even beyond schools in our everyday lives. Like I mentioned earlier, I mean, I see it everywhere and I keep a journal with me every year and I just document and write different things that I'm feeling or experiencing. And it's just a powerful means for me to really explore not only myself but others around me and then sharing that with other people. It always feels so like it feels vulnerable, but it feels powerful. Like I resonate with you said earlier, Dr. Gill, I'm sorry. Um, but like a star shooting out of your chest. And I thought even that was very poetic. Like it's just beautiful. And I think this forum, you know, deserves a lot more attention than what it's given in schools and when it's given across um, just society in general. So thank you all. And these efforts that we discussed today make space for considering alternative ways to envision poetry into our practice and in our everyday lives. We deeply appreciate the time of these scholars and their contributions to our understanding of poetry and the wider literacies field. Again, thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of Inquiring Minds podcast focused on poetry. And a big thank you to our panelists for engaging in such a delightful and inspiring conversation about what's possible when we decenter whiteness or decenter Eurocentric ideas in poetry and move beyond to a space of um, collective healing, collective sharing. I think there's so much potential here. We thoroughly enjoyed hearing all of you all speak and share your time with us today. And we know our listeners will also enjoy this conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you. Nice meeting everyone. Bye.